True Crime Conversations acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast was recorded on. In 1993, 15-year-old Canadian Chrissy Harron was being a typical teenager. She didn't love school. In fact, she had a history of skipping classes. She was messy, a bit of a tomboy, and according to a friend, a bit of an easy target for bullies too. She'd been struggling with her parents' divorce. Her dad lived too far away for regular visits, and she didn't really get along with her new stepdad, but she was trying. Amongst the arguments, there would also be moments where they would connect, helping him out in the garage, replacing the spark plugs in his car. A sensitive and shy girl, Chrissy wasn't a partier. In fact, her parents had praised her when she'd returned from an event because she said she felt uncomfortable with her peers drinking and smoking. Chrissy loved her mum, Marianne, but like any teen-parent relationship, they also fought. And so when her mum told her to get to school on the afternoon of May 18, 1993, she put on her jacket and reluctantly started the short walk over. Marianne will remember this moment for the rest of her life, like a scar that never heals, because that argument would be the last time she would ever speak to her daughter.
And then she left to go to school. She walked down the other side of the street and around the corner. And that was the last I've seen of her.
I'm Claire Murphy, and this is True Crime Conversations, a podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. It's a parent's worst nightmare, a missing child, a police force who thinks every teenager is a runaway, and a mother who desperately searches despite the roadblocks she faces from the authorities. The case of missing Ontario teen Chrissy Harron would not be one solved in a year, not even a decade on from her disappearance, but a shock confession, a botched court case, an undercover sting, and more than 20 years later, someone would finally be held accountable for her death. Chrissy Harron's body has never been found, but the person who took her life is paying for his crime, thanks to the dedication of a mother and one independent film and podcast maker. David Ridgen worked alongside Chrissy's mother, Marianne, for more than 15 years as they brought her killer to justice. The host of the Someone Knows Something podcast sat down with us to tell us how a mother's undying love can outlast it all. Before we dive into the interview with David, there are a few key points you should understand to fully grasp Chrissy's story and David's investigation. Police kept Anthony Ringel in custody for 37 hours. 5 hours of that was before he was even read his rights. He was allowed phone calls to lawyers after he requested legal representation, spending a total of around 20 minutes only on calls with them, but no lawyer attended the questioning. When asked to explain himself on the record, Ringel would only say, "No questions, no comment." Despite this, police continued to question him, often without taking notes or recording the conversation. A second officer stepped in to take over the interrogation after it had seemingly wrapped up. Ringel said he did not want to continue and said he was advised by the lawyer not to take them to the place that he had initially told the officer after calling 911 that Chrissy's body was, but they took him anyway. The list of questionable police conduct was adding up as Ringel's confusing and sometimes barely audible responses continued. He would switch from admitting to the murder to no comment. When asked why he would confess to it if he didn't do it, he gave no real answer. Several undercover police officers would infiltrate the trailer park where Ringel lived. They connected with him by telling him how they too were victims doing it tough in life. Then, one night, they sat down and watched the documentary about him. In the footage, taken over many hours, Ringel would get upset with what he said were inconsistencies in the documentary's telling of his story. He would say they got it wrong when they claimed he drowned her. He had, in fact, more suffocated Chrissy by pushing her face down into the mud. He explained how he'd used her jacket to restrict her hands as he had nothing to tie her up with. That enabled him, he said, to remove her pants. He described the location where it all took place, just across the river, and how he had just come across her in the park that day, a place she used to frequent. He explained how he left her out there the first night before returning to cover her body with sticks and logs the next day. Ringel also told the undercover officers how he'd thought about doing it again, but in almost attempting to justify the crime, Ringel said that by only doing it once and never again, essentially, he'd been a good person. He even went as far as to say that he hoped he had the opportunity to apologise to Chrissy in the afterlife, where he would ask her, was her life better before or after he did what he did? I know you've been investigating the case of Christine, or Chrissy as she was known, Harron, for, gosh, it must be getting close to 2 decades now. But I'd love to take you back to the beginning. When did you first hear about her story and what led you to really focus in on this one?
For Christine Harron, I'm a documentary filmmaker before I was a podcaster. And I had been looking at, cold cases in general for television since 2004. And at the time I found out about Chrissy's case, I was developing some television documentaries for CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, in late 2000s, I think, about cold cases, obviously. And I recall Chrissy's case made the shortlist pretty much right away for several reasons. I attended a memorial service for her in Hanover, which is a small town here in Ontario, southwest Ontario, just to do some initial research and something about the service for her photo up there on the stand, how people spoke about her, the whole atmosphere was very thick. It made me want to try to help. And I remember saying to the associate producer who was there with me at the time that Chrissy was someone I wish I'd been able to meet. And I remember actually crying. And I remember feeling this kind of heat of frustration about the case. I just kind of knew that I wanted to help on it. But I wasn't able to at the time. There are other cases took over in the early stages. But eventually I did get to Chrissy's case as the fourth in a series of films I made for CBC. And then the podcast kind of came after that. So there's several stages of production that went into Chrissy's case.
Well, talk to me a bit about what it was about Chrissy that made you feel like she was someone that you wanted to meet. What was she like, and what did you learn about who she was as a person?
Christine was 15 at the time she disappeared. She was rebellious. She didn't like school, but she enjoyed her walks outside. She liked the natural world. She liked reading. She liked being around children. She had that kind of, like I say, kind of counterintuitive nature that maybe she didn't get along with everybody, but she was very kind. And I could just tell the way people were talking about her that that's what she was like. And, when I met her mother, Marianne, I saw some video of Chrissy at the time, and it was quite touching around the Christmas tree and things like that. It's hard to explain, really, what makes me want to take on a case. There's some other factors that were interesting as well, but mainly just the way it struck me at that ceremony for her.
Well, let's delve into Chrissy's story. It's May 18, 1993. You mentioned there that she didn't love going to school and she'd woken up that morning and claimed to be unwell. Whether she actually was or not is a question many parents ask themselves about their children when they're trying to get out of going to school. But her mum was a bit concerned about the truancy officer, Marianne, who you mentioned, and insisted her daughter does go to school that day. So she kind of sends her off. What was Chrissy's reaction to her mum trying to force her to go to school that day?
Well, I think it's like anything. If you try to make it happen, the opposite happens. Like, if you try to force that idea out of your head, it's actually, it galvanizes the idea in your head. So I think that by trying to get Chrissy to go to school, she was less likely to want to go. But eventually, I think maybe a plan formulated in Chrissy's head that, okay, I'll go to school, but not go to school. I'll go to school the long way. And it turned out that on that morning she was sick, and it was May 18th, 1993, as you said. They had an argument, and the truancy officer called. And so I guess it was around 1 or midday in the afternoon that Chrissy finally said, okay, got up, left, and slammed the door. And this was allegedly on her way to school. Marianne saw her go down the street and turn the corner, and that was the last that she ever saw of her. And it turns out that Chrissy didn't go to school that day.
Was her mother then the last person to actually see her alive apart from the person who would take her life? Did anybody else spot her in the aftermath of her disappearance?
There was nobody else that came forward at the time. Nobody else reported to police or by police to my knowledge, and I've looked through thousands of pages of investigative information over 2 different police departments, the local department and the OPP, the Ontario Provincial Police, which took over in 1999. Nobody else saw Chrissy that day, to my knowledge, or anybody else's, except for the person who killed her.
So Marianne does what most parents would do in the situation where their kid, who is known for skipping classes at school, calls all their friends. She doesn't have a big circle of friends, but none of them have seen her. Police say it's too early to really do anything, but she does report it to police later that night. What was the police's initial response to Marianne's request for them to search for her daughter?
Well, initially, police, and in many cases this happens, right or wrong, police suggest that she'll come back. She's a runaway. And usually that's a pretty temporary maneuver by police. Usually it's give it some time. Unfortunately, everybody knows in the true crime world that the first 72 hours and blah, blah, blah are important, and they are. And in this case, though, the police kept to that story, kept to that narrative. The local police chief, his daughter had a habit of departing, apparently, according to him. So he was citing these kind of anecdotal stories of she'll be back, my daughter always comes back kind of thing. But that went on for like a year. And there were these false sightings of Chrissy in Toronto. Police kept, suggesting that maybe she was with those people that were being seen in Toronto, or she was with a bunch of punk rockers or something. But basically nothing ever came back of a real true sighting of Chrissy. And in the meantime, important time was passing. If you get to know the story, you'll realize that this was a massive mistake at this time, because they could have probably found her if they did a proper search. They only undertook a sort of rudimentary search around town, and they never found any trace of her. But if they had taken it a little bit more seriously, I'm not sure what would have made them take it more seriously, maybe more experience. It was a very small force, local town force, the Hanover Police. In fact, the man who investigated the case in the beginning was later arrested for, some kind of horrible crimes he himself committed. So I'm not sure how great of an investigator he was. The Ontario Provincial Police, when they took over the case, reinvestigated everything. They re-interviewed everybody. They talked to other people that they hadn't talked to before in the other investigation, but still nothing happened. That was 1999. This happened in 1993. So nothing the police did really made any difference to the case.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Claire Murphy. I'm speaking with David Ridgen, host of the podcast Someone Knows Something, about the case of Chrissy Harron. Next, David and I dive into why Marianne's search for her daughter was derailed, and how the community in Hanover, Ontario, not only failed to help, but actually told her to give up. Do you think the police's attitude to Chrissy's disappearance contributed to how the community responded to Marianne and her other family members in that time? Because Marianne spoke to you and said that, she would put up posters asking for information about the whereabouts of her missing daughter that would get torn down, and that people kept telling her to kind of let it go, and that, Chrissy was just off, being a rebellious teenager. Do you think the police's attitude didn't help, that the community didn't seem to rally around them?
Yeah, I'm not sure that it did help. I think communities tend to have kind of a singular mind sometimes, and if one person thinks something, then many of them will think the same thing. They definitely, Chrissy and Marianne were not wealthy people. They were not from a wealthy background or family, working class family, very much so. And I'm not sure how much that impacted the case, but I can only imagine it did. This person's not as important as everybody else, which is another part of the reason I thought the case was important. Yeah, if police take it seriously, other people will take it seriously too.
We did mention that eventually the OPP does take over the case from the local police, but that is 6 years down the track. Do we know what actually led to that being escalated beyond the local police?
I think the local police in Hanover asked, but I also think that there was some pressure from Marianne and her family about this case. And I think that eventually took over. See, the OPP in Ontario at that time was expanding, and they were trying to basically usurp small town forces and take over them and be paid by the municipality instead of the small town force. So they would argue, for example, we're a force of 1,000 members, investigators. We have a huge forensic team and we got lots of money. Why would you want to have 4 men or 4 people, policing your city or town of 6,000 when you could have, Uber force taking over? But, a lot of times towns did pay to have OPP come in and then were unhappy because the sort of roster or menu of what they were going to be providing investigatively was not what they expected. However, in this case, the OPP took over the case and I think eventually took over policing in the town, just like many other small towns in Ontario at the time. So I guess it was part of an expansionist effort. So it kind of worked into the parents requesting that the OPP take it over. So, it might have been the thin edge of the wedge that allowed the OPP to kind of start to make their move on that town as well. I may be talking out of my ass on that one. I'm not exactly sure about that history, but that's pretty much what I think happened.
Were Chrissy's family told anything about these investigations? Like, how much information were they given after the escalation to the OPP?
Very little. And that's not abnormal, but when you hide things from parents, you do it to help protect the case to some extent. I understand the impulse to do that. You don't want to distribute information to somebody who you think might then tell someone else that there's a suspect or that you're talking to this guy or, and then that information gets seeded around the community. And soon enough, everybody's pointing at the same guy just because the police said they're interviewing him to somebody, right? So you're kind of seeding the information, poisoning the case by giving out too much information. But you would think that at some point police would learn to trust family members and realize that they kind of need the information to kind of help them get through their day-to-day, They need something to hold on to.
You can see how that might be an issue because the place where they live is not big, right? It's not a huge community of people. It's less than 10,000, and that's pretty small town mentality when you think about it, right?
Yeah, it's pretty small. It was a pretty big industrial base when it started. It was like a furniture making place in Ontario. I think a lot of German settlers moved in at one point, and lots of furniture production. But when I started working there and when Chrissy disappeared, it was kind of a shadow of that. A lot of abandoned buildings and old factories around. And it was a small town down on its luck to some extent. Yeah, when I got in there.
We mentioned old factories. What's a really interesting piece of evidence was that a young man in that community claimed in the aftermath of Chrissy's disappearance that he received a phone call from someone claiming to be her and that she was in fact at one of these old abandoned factories. Did anything come of that?
Nothing came of that. And in any of the documentation I've read extensively on that, it feels like somebody was playing a joke on this guy. I'm sure he got the call, but it felt like somebody was making a prank call on him. And I think that's what police figured out at the end as well. I mean, obviously, Chrissy didn't show up. It was 2 months later, I think. She would have had no resources. It's a small town. Like, yeah, you can hide in a building for a couple of days, but it's not credible. And there was some other issues with the person who got the call, which I'm not going to mention now, but it seems like that it wasn't the first time that crank calls were made, let's just say.
Well, let's fast forward. 11 years has passed since Chrissy's disappeared. It's August 2004. There's finally a breakthrough in the case, but it does not come from any police investigation. Can you talk us through a bit of the surprise confession?
Part of the reason I was intrigued by Chrissy's case, the other part, is because there appeared to be a suspect. But this is a suspect that the police had not found. Up until August of 2004, police had no idea what happened to Chrissy, as I just talked about. And remember, Chrissy disappeared, as you said, 11 years ago, 11 years before in May of 1993. So in August 2004, at a party with his family members, a man age 35 at the time, near the end of the evening after some drinks and some kind of upset he had with his family, started telling people that he had killed Christine Harron. He picked up the phone, he dialed 911, and then he hung up. He changed his mind. But the police responded anyway. I don't know what happens in Australia, but here, even on a hang-up to a 911 call, they will respond to find out what the hang-up was all about. So the police officer arrives, the man notices and starts walking down the stairs towards him, holding his hands up as if he wants to be handcuffed. And he confesses, again, I killed Chrissy. Says, I killed Chrissy to the responding officer. And he says, I can show police where I left her. And at the same time, 11 years earlier, when Chrissy disappeared, the guy would have been 24 years old at that time. And his name was Anthony Edward Ringle. And this is a guy police had was not on the radar. Local guy. And he was born on December 10th, 1968, one of 6 children, 5'9" or thereabouts, blunt features, thin browning hair. And he had worked at the local Canadian Tire, which is like a hardware store that, yes, does sell tires here. But he was unemployed at the time in May 1993 when Chrissy left the house to allegedly go to school that May. And when I met him, he was living between locations, like at a family member's house, couch surfing, and at a local trailer park. So Anthony Ringle goes through the stages of what would have been a murder trial in 2006. They took him to the police station and interrogated him. But the judge throws the case out, basically, because of police mistakes. So this is 2006, and I heard about the case in 2009. So the case has stayed in 2006 for a year. So basically, it sits in suspended animation until new evidence is brought forward, but no new evidence was brought forward. So Ringle is freed, and nothing new happens, and it just sits there from 2006 onwards. And at the time, Anthony still lived in the area. Nobody did anything. There was very little reporting on it. Like, there was like one article in the paper about this. No reporter talks to him. No police action can be seen happening. Still 2006. And then add 3 years more, and I come on the scene, 2009, church service, etc. And I begin working with Chrissy's mom, Mary Ann. Police barely assist me, but regardless, we're able to uncover many of the court files and investigative documents from the case by freedom of information. Mary Ann, for the first time, learns what's actually happening, or what happened. Why did it fail? Why did the case get thrown out? Some of what Anthony said. And we go from there. That's the television doc part. So that's what I'm shooting with my camera for television. So the podcast covers that and takes over with the new process. So throughout the process, we have Mary Ann confronting the murderer. Like, we try to go to visit him. He won't talk to us. It doesn't work out the scenario the way we had imagined it. So I go try to speak to this guy myself, Anthony Ringle. I do meet him. I cold knock on his trailer door at a trailer park, the same trailer park. We speak for a long time, and I ask him the direct and pointed question, did you kill Christine? And you'll hear the answers in the podcast. So all that information about the case, the court drama, talking to Ringle, all that stuff goes into a 20-minute doc made for CBC, goes to air in the spring of 2012. And then shortly after the documentary went to air, the television documentary, police start an undercover operation on Anthony Ringle in the same trailer park where I met him. So then the podcast takes over and tells that story and picks up where the TV show left off, because nobody knows about this undercover operation. This is all brand new news that this podcast is breaking, basically.
So do police actually tell you that your documentary is the catalyst for this undercover operation? Do they say why they actually start this when they've left this case kind of just sitting there for so long?
I can only assume that it had something to do with it, because it basically, the documentary exposes a ton of police errors and mistakes. And it's very embarrassing for the OPP, who's been telling people that they're such an amazing investigative force, and to some extent they are. So it picks up, tells the story of the undercover operation, and it shows directly that the work Mary and I did is literally used by police so they can arrest Anthony again. So the film is literally used so they can get him again in February 2013. So, except this time, the trial in 2016 goes forward, and he's convicted, and now is serving a life sentence here in Ontario in a federal penitentiary. Second-degree murder, they got him on. And yeah, I feel good about it. That's the next question. How do you feel about that? And it's pretty amazing that the work did its job. So that's all I can say about it. I think people have to listen for themselves, but it's a real up and down roller coaster and quite satisfying. It's over 15 years of work, so.
What's really interesting too is, that work, you have worked alongside Marianne for that entire time. And without you, she would not know the majority of the things that happened during the first court case or even during the second, because she was considered a potential witness, so wasn't allowed to sit in court. So she never got to see any of those undercover videos that were recorded by police. You actually played them to her. What was that like? Because Ringel goes into quite a bit of detail about what he actually did.
Yeah.
And that would have been heartbreaking to show to her.
It is heartbreaking and it's awful. And Marianne wanted to see it. And I still didn't show her, she knows this. I didn't show her everything because some of it is just it's really hard. It's one thing to, that somebody killed someone, there's the perpetrator. But when you hear them talking about it in such great detail in the confession that they gave to the undercover officer, and they don't know they're being filmed, it's a real vulnerability that they kind of expose everything about what their thinking was. And it's quite dark in a way that's blacker than black, in terms of that kind of darkness. So I didn't want to expose Marianne to that level. But I do think, and she believes too, that confronting the stuff actually helps. So we made the decision to watch it together, some of the confession, just to kind of get the story of what happened that day, like why did you take her, etc. And I mean, the answer why is like, I hate Mondays, like why did you do it? I mean, that's not really that interesting actually to me. And I don't think to Marianne, but it's more sort of tell me what happened, what happened that day. So I think that's what she had in her head. And we watched some of the undercover stuff together. I tried to talk about the other things that I didn't show her sort of in a general way. And I think it did help her. I mean, she's told me it has. That's all I can go on. And she's told others that it has. So
she does say to you, though, that, and she said this to other media outlets too, that not even Ringel ending up with a life sentence is closure for her, that you can never truly get closure in a case like this. But you have been trying to help her kind of get as close as possible to that, right? Has Ringel ever agreed to sit down and speak with Marianne about what happened that day?
Not yet. I mean, I think closure's bullshit myself. And I think Marianne kind of agrees, but I think it's kind of a media presentation, the idea of closure, because it kind of adds an ending to a story. I don't think closure is actually possible. I think it's more acceptance that you're looking for and trying to be able to move away from having to try to solve the case every day and every second in your head. It's okay to walk away from that, and it's okay to have a good time. It's okay to live my life again, and I don't think that means closure. I just think it means that you have to accept this thing in you that's horrible, that you're this loss. You have to accept that and just live with it like a bubble inside you that's never going to go away, and then continue. And that's what she's looking for. But also, she wants to know where Chrissy is. and that's one of the things that I've found in many cold cases or with the families of missing people, is that they don't care about the perpetrator. They don't give a fuck about that person. They don't give a fuck about what that person wanted to do or what they did. They just want to know where their loved one is. They want to know where their daughter is. Bring her to me. I don't care about you. Bring her to me. Tell me where she is. And I think if some perps knew exactly how simple it might be to help themselves and help the families, they could just tell that little part of the equation, So I've been trying to help Marianne find Chrissy, because we know where generally she was led to by Ringel that day, very specifically, actually. And we did try with cadaver dogs, Kim Cooper, whom I'm known to be, to work with on other cases, came with me. And we went too late in the season because the ferns were almost above my head. And the dogs, it helps to have an open area. Dogs, it can't be closed in like big umbrellas over the ground. It has to be open so the smell moves around. So we're going back on Good Friday, actually, this month. because the ferns won't be up as high. I actually don't even think they'll be emerged. They'll be what they call fiddleheads here, which is like the tiny 1 foot high things. But that will be much more preferable. I think we have a good chance of getting some scent and maybe finding Chrissy or some element of Chrissy's remains. So we're going to go back and try again.
David, how do cases like this impact you personally? I mean, you see something like this where it is literally people's worst nightmare, that a stranger will come out of nowhere, snatch you or snatch your child, and horrifically, rape and murder you or your child. Like, that is the stuff of nightmares. How do you personally, emotionally get through that, especially when you're there with Marianne, with her mum, and not take some of that emotion on board?
Well, I guess there's no real secret. I guess I do take it on board, and I don't really deal with it. I think at a younger age in this process, I might have thought that I could get through it without getting affected. But the truth is, like, I can just keep pushing things downstream. And then when the work's over, maybe 6 months later, that wave catches up. And I often feel a sudden panic attack or can't breathe, or moment where it's just overwhelming, sleep problems. And I've got another case I'm working on right now, and several more planned. I don't know how much more I can do. I'm not a younger man. I think people think I'm like 25, but I've done a ton of these, and I feel like I've worked cases just as hard, if not harder, than some police investigators have, and certainly been as exposed, or maybe even more, to some of the stuff because of the relationship with the family and how close and how long the relationship is. But I did choose this. It's not, oh, poor David. I choose to be in the seat talking to you. And it's, the families and the police that experience these cases have my sympathies. And I'm, that part of the reason I know what they're feeling. And I know that I can help the situation. So I feel like I'm using the things I've learned and helping them to help myself, which, if that makes sense.
David, it's been nearly 10 years since Ringel pled guilty back in 2016. What do we know of him now? Is there any chance of him getting out of jail anytime soon? Any possibility he might let the family know what happened that day or where Chrissy is?
We've been trying to get in touch with him. I think that eventually he will get out. There will be an opportunity to be released. He may or may not make that opportunity on the first time or two. Eventually, I think he will be released, and I think eventually we will be able to talk to him. Like, I'm not giving up on that approach to him. Once he gets out, he'll be in the community again. He'll be right back, probably in the same trailer park. And I'm just going to go back up and knock on the door. If I'm 80, I'll do it, Like, I don't go away, which is part of the problem, but it's also part of the promise that I make. So that's how I get into these cases.
Thanks to David for helping us tell this story. True Crime Conversations is hosted by me, Claire Murphy, and produced by Tali Blackman, with audio design by Jacob Round. Thank you so much for listening. I'll be back next week with another True Crime Conversation.